In 1520, a Portuguese horse trader named Domingo Paes climbed a hill on the edge of a city in southern India. He stood at the top, and he looked out over what lay below him. He later wrote in his Chronicle, and I quote his exact recorded words, "What I saw from thence seemed to me as large as Rome, and very beautiful to the sight. It is the best provided city in the world." That city was called Vijayanagara, the City of Victory. Today you know it as Hampi, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the state of Karnataka, where tourists walk through the ruins and take photographs. And almost none of them know what they are standing in. Because in 1520, when Domingo Paes climbed that hill, Vijayanagara was not ruins. It was the second largest city on earth, home to 500,000 people, larger than London, larger than Lisbon, larger than any city in Europe, richer than almost anywhere on the planet. 45 years later, it was gone. Not slowly, not over decades. In a single afternoon in January 1565. This is the story of Vijayanagara, the greatest city you have never heard of, and the one afternoon that erased it from history. To understand what was lost in 1565, you have to understand what had been built. Vijayanagara was not just a city. It was the capital of an empire that had dominated southern India for 200 years. Founded in 1336 by two brothers, Harihara and Bukka Raya, on the banks of the Tungabhadra River in Karnataka. They built it, according to tradition, on the very ground where the Hindu epic Ramayana says Rama met the monkey king Sugriva. Sacred ground, the foundation of a civilization. For the next 2 centuries, the Vijayanagara Empire did something no power in South India had managed before. It held. While kingdoms fell to invasions from the north, while the Mughals swept across the subcontinent, Vijayanagara held its ground. It became the last great Hindu empire of the Deccan, a bulwark, a civilization that refused to disappear. And the city they built reflected that ambition. 7 concentric walls of fortification surrounded it. The outermost wall enclosed an area of more than 60 square miles. Within those walls, palaces, temples, markets, gardens, aqueducts, artificial lakes. Foreign traders from Persia, Portugal, Arabia, and China came to do business here. Merchants sold diamonds on the open streets, not as a special occasion, as an ordinary day. At its peak under Emperor Krishnadevaraja in the early 16th century, one of the most celebrated rulers in all of Indian history, Vijayanagara was described by every foreign visitor who came there as something beyond imagination. A Persian ambassador wrote that the city's wealth could not be described. A Portuguese traveler said the king's treasury contained more gold than he had ever seen or heard of in any kingdom. And Domingo Paes, standing on that hill, simply compared it to Rome, the greatest city he knew, and said Vijayanagara was its equal. Then Krishnadevaraja died in 1529, and the empire he had built, through diplomacy, through military genius, through sheer force of personality, began to fracture. His successors lacked his skill. The man who came to hold real power after them was a regent named Aliya Rama Raya. Brilliant, ruthless, and dangerously overconfident. To the north of Vijayanagara lay 5 rival Muslim sultanates, Bijapur, Golconda, Ahmadnagar, Bidar, and Berar, which had emerged from the breakup of the old Bahmani Sultanate. These sultanates competed constantly with each other, and Rama Raya was extraordinarily skilled at exploiting those rivalries. He played them against each other. He allied with one against another, then switched sides. He used the sultanates like chess pieces, hiring their soldiers, funding their enemies, intervening in their internal politics whenever it suited him. For years it worked. Vijayanagara grew stronger. The sultanates fought among themselves. But there is a point at which brilliance becomes arrogance, and Rama Raya crossed it. By the early 1560s, his interference had become intolerable. The sultanates had been humiliated too many times. Their rulers had watched Rama Raya manipulate them, dismiss them, and treat their kingdoms as pieces on his board. And in 1564, for the first time in their history, All five of them agreed to set aside every rivalry, every grievance, every old war between themselves, and unite against one enemy, Vijayanagara. Rama Raya received the intelligence of the alliance forming against him. He was not afraid. He had faced larger threats. He had won every time. He was 80 years old and had never lost a major battle. He rode out to meet them with the largest army Vijayanagara had ever assembled. Reports suggest hundreds of thousands of soldiers, war elephants, cavalry, artillery, the full weight of the most powerful empire in southern India. The two sides met on the plains near the villages of Talikota and Rakshasatangadi on the banks of the Krishna River. The date was January 23, 1565. At first, the battle went well for Vijayanagara. Rama Raya's forces pushed the Sultanate armies back on the left and right flanks. For hours it looked like another Vijayanagara victory. Then something happened that nobody in the Vijayanagara army expected. In the center of their own formation, two Muslim generals who had been serving in the Vijayanagara army switched sides. The Jilani brothers, commanders Rama Raya himself had trusted. In the middle of the battle, they turned their soldiers around and attacked the army they had been fighting for. The formation collapsed. In the chaos of the betrayal, Rama Raya was captured. He was brought before Sultan Hussein of Ahmadnagar, and he was beheaded on the battlefield. His head was displayed to the Vijayanagara forces, the army that had never lost, that had held the Deccan for 200 years, collapsed in panic. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers fled. The field was abandoned. The battle was over. The news reached Vijayanagara before the dust had settled. Rama Raya's brother Tirumala gathered the royal family. He gathered what he could of the treasury. He loaded it onto the backs of hundreds of elephants. And he left. He left the city. He left the 500,000 people who lived in it. He left without a plan to defend it. 2 days later, the Sultanate armies arrived. What they found was not a city preparing to fight. It was a city that had been abandoned by its rulers. What followed lasted 6 months. The plundering of Vijayanagara was unlike anything recorded in the history of the Deccan. Every palace, every temple, every market where diamonds had been sold on ordinary days. Stripped, burned, smashed. The population, those who had not fled, massacred or enslaved. The aqueducts that had fed the gardens, destroyed. The buildings that Domingo Paes had called more beautiful than Rome, reduced to the rubble that tourists walk through today. 2 years after the battle, an Italian traveler named Cesare Federici passed through the ruins. He wrote, and I quote his exact recorded words, "The houses stand still, but empty, and there is dwelling in them nothing, as is reported, but tigers and other wild beasts." In 1520, the second largest city on earth. In 1567, tigers. Vijayanagara was never rebuilt, never reoccupied. The capital moved. The empire limped on for another century in diminished form. But the city itself, the Rome of India, the place Domingo Paes called the best provided city in the world, was simply left. To the jungle, to the silence, to the tigers. What was lost that day is almost impossible to calculate. The temples of Hampi, whose ruins are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, represent perhaps 10% of what stood there before 1565. The manuscripts, the music, the literature written under Krishnadevara, one of the greatest patrons of art and learning in Indian history. The architecture, the engineering of those aqueducts and lakes, the knowledge systems of 200 years of a civilization at its height, gone in 6 months. When the British archaeologist Robert Sewell published his study of Vijayanagara in 1900, he titled it simply, "A Forgotten Empire." That title tells you everything. An empire that stretched across all of southern India. A city the size of Rome. 500,000 people. Forgotten. The people of Hampi today, the priests at the Virupaksha temple that survived the destruction, the farmers who work the fields around the ruins. They are the descendants of the people who were there in 1565. They remember. Their history was not forgotten by them. It was forgotten by everyone else. The ruins are still there. You can walk through them. You can climb the hill where Domingo Paes stood in 1520. You can look out over what remains and try to imagine what he saw. A city as large as Rome, the best provided city in the world.